If you know you're going to get hit for trying something that is inherently risky and you're not going to get rewarded, guess what? You're not going to do it. That's in fact why a lot of people leave large companies to go start their own companies because they know if things go well, they'll become a billionaire.
Hello, and welcome back to Off to the Valley, the podcast where we uncover the inspiring journeys of entrepreneurs, leaders, and innovators who are redefining industries and creating meaningful impact. I'm your host, Prateek Panda, and today we are excited to be joined by Nick Jain, a versatile leader and the CEO of IdeaScale, the world's top innovation management software platform. Nick's journey is one of transformation and resilience, from navigating setbacks like the closure of a hedge fund to mastering leadership across various industries like trucking, fashion, and tech. At IdeaScale, Nick is driving innovations for organizations like NASA, Comcast, NASCAR, and so many others, leveraging AI and fostering collaboration to empower groundbreaking ideas. Nick, it's a pleasure to have you on the show, and I'm looking forward to learning more from your journey.
Thank you so much for having me, Pratik, and for the kind introduction.
Great. So let's start from the top. Tell us a little bit more about Nick Jain. What's your background? A little bit about your upbringing so that everybody understands who you are.
Sure. So I'm based in Philadelphia right now. I live here with my wife and a 1 month old newborn.
Oh,
So pretty part
congratulations.
of my life. I was raised in a mixture of Canada and India and emigrated to the United States for college. My undergraduate degree was in theoretical physics and mathematics, did my MBA at Harvard Business School, and I'd break my career into two parts. One was as a professional investor working in large cap hedge funds and private equity, investing in other companies. And for the last 5 or so years, I've been a professional CEO. So either founders, private equity firms, or companies hire me when their companies are ready for that next stage of success. And that could be a struggling company that needs a turnaround or a company that is doing well that wants to do extraordinarily well.
Okay, great. So you told me a few things there. One is your background growing up in India, Canada, and then the US. At any point, was it your choice to move to a particular place, or were you carried along with your family?
Yeah. So I made two choices and moved. When I moved to the United States for college, that was my choice. I got into a good college. They gave me a lot of scholarship money. So it was an easy choice. After college, I also made a choice to actually go back and work in India for about a year for a nonprofit and research think tank there. So that was also a choice. And then since I moved to the US, I've lived in about 4 or 5 different cities: New York, San Francisco, Boston, Philadelphia, Houston. And those have all been my choices as an adult as well.
That's great. Tell me a little bit about what's influenced you to make these choices, right? Like it's a lot of varied environments moving from, yes, you have Indian origin and you moved, you spent some time in Canada and then in the US. What motivated you to go spend time again in India?
Sure. Spending time in India after college was three things. Number one, I hadn't been back to India where my family was from. Hindi is my mother tongue. I hadn't seen some family there. I hadn't been back in a long time and I missed the country where I'd grown up, or at least for part of my childhood. So I went back partially for that reason, just a personal reason to hang out with family. Number two, the job was really cool. I was doing economics research. So I'm a very quantitatively oriented guy. It was basically testing the waters for whether an academic career is right for me. And number three, it was a really tremendous career opportunity. I got to work for a woman, Esther Duflo, a professor at MIT, and she was on the short list to win the Nobel Prize in economics at that time. She actually did end up winning the Nobel Prize in economics. So you can think, for a 22-year-old, that's a pretty cool career opportunity when someone you're pretty sure is going to win the Nobel Prize says, "Come work for me."
That sounds amazing. And then what brought you back to the US? I believe it was your decision to go to Harvard.
Yeah, I actually went and worked in private equity and consulting and private equity for a while. So I came back to my fellowship over in India working for Esther Duflo was about a year long. So after that fellowship finished, I came back to the United States and realized I did not want to go the academic path. And I accepted an offer that I deferred from McKinsey, the consulting firm. I told them, "Hey, I'm going to go off to India to do this for a year." And then when I came back, I just resumed the kind of the typical trajectory I was on to go down a more corporate finance investing professional track, which ultimately then led to business school, did some more investing afterwards, and then ended up being a professional executive.
So all of this varied experience, right, working in different parts of the world, how do you think that has influenced your business acumen as well as leadership style?
I'll say a few things. Number one, I think while we're all human, there are huge differences between people, both at an individual level and cultural level. The way I would do business with somebody in India is very different than Japan, than the United States, than Germany. In some places, you do business in a bar. In some places, you do it in a hotel. In some places, you do it in a conference room. That's all very different, right? The way you hand a business card to someone in Japan is very different from the way you do it so in India. So I think, and that's true at an individual level, even within the United States, not just across countries. I think having worked in different countries and different cultural contexts has made me appreciate how very different people are in their communication styles and their ways of doing work, and give me a greater respect for that, as well as greater training in how to deal with or work effectively with a wide variety. Number two, I think it's exposed me to the fact that there's all these strange forms of businesses or business models that wouldn't make sense to me, right? Like the economics of street food businesses in India are very different from those of running like a New York hot dog stand. The New York hot dog stand makes actually is like complicated because of the amount of regulation that goes into it. And that also applies to large scale business. There's business models that exist in East Asia, for example, in Japan and Korea, with these large conglomerates that are basically backed by banks, where the bank is basically owning an operating company that, for example, are illegal in the United States. In the United States, banks can't typically own operating companies, whereas that is in fact the standard business model for mega corporations in Japan and Korea.
That's awesome. So tell me a little bit about how you've translated some of that into what you do in your day to day.
So I think spending a bunch of time across different countries, but then also as a professional investor, I got exposed to what the differences between good businesses are and bad businesses, as well as to how to understand that analytically. So when I look at a business, I don't just get a feeling that, hey, it's a really attractive business and they've got an amazing marketing campaign and a great product. There's actually a lot of analytics I can bring to bear to understand whether a business is a good business or a bad business, that a very quantitative approach. So that means that when I actually step into an operating role, I could look at a business, understand these are the strengths and weaknesses, not at a qualitative fuzzy level, but rather incredibly analytically, and then actually implement the changes to make those businesses more effective. One implication of that is almost actually all of the three businesses I've either run or co-run experienced something like a doubling of profit margins within the first 12 months while I was there. And often without any layoffs or any human cost cutting. So that's pretty cool that you can double the profitability of a business without firing people.
What are some things that you typically take a look at?
Sure. I think there's two or three areas. Number one is, what are the costs? There's a bunch of costs businesses accumulate that they forget to shut off. You can imagine somebody signed up for some subscription software or some mailing and newsletter, and they're just paying for all these things that no one's using, or extra seats for something, right? Shutting down an office that no one's has, or a PO box. So getting rid of like wasteful spending that is not even used. Number two, upgrading to spending that is more effective. So it turns out you can often get better things for a lower cost if you actually go back and reevaluate every cost of the line item. And that's conceptually ties into something called zero-based budgeting. The idea that every cost needs to justify itself every single year because you're starting from a clean sheet rather than building progressively from year to year. And the third is to change how decision-making is made. In a lot of organizations, people make decisions based on how they feel or what the senior most person said. And there isn't actually a good framework for doing that. In fact, the only right framework for good decision-making, whether short-term or long-term, is ROI in a private sector context, return on investment. You should be thinking about your marketing campaign, your product development, your software engineering, your sales, all need to be ROI-based investments. And so I strongly emphasize senior leaders at the companies I run to learn this methodology and then to apply it from everything as simple as, should I spend $100 to go to this conference, to should I spend $1 million to build this new piece of software?
So tell me this, right? There are two schools of thought here. One is what you're explaining, almost like a PE style, where you're driving more efficiency out of a business. And then there is this whole intense growth, VC bag, hockey stick curve of growth sort of model where you're focusing pretty much a lot on your top line and maybe not so much on the bottom line. Where do you think it makes sense to spend time and evaluate every single line item on whether we should go spend an extra $100 to do this, where the cost of making the decision or the cost of time to make that decision is more valuable?
So what you just said, the cost of the time is more valuable than the $100 savings. So that's a negative ROI decision. So you shouldn't be doing it, right? If the amount of time it takes to go save those costs is greater than the benefit of the cost, that in itself is a negative ROI action and you shouldn't take it. going back to your differentiation of like growth-based investing or growth-based operating versus kind of profit-based operating, I think that's an artificial distinction. Good growth investors or good venture capital investors are not buying growth for the sake of growth. It is growth that will eventually lead to a profitable ROI positive business. In fact, if you actually look over the past decade, there's been a lot of really bad venture-backed businesses that grew like hockey sticks. They had, I can name, without naming names, there's a couple of billion-dollar revenue businesses that were actually bad businesses and eventually went bankrupt. Actually, we can name a public one, WeWork, right? WeWork grew to an enormous size, but they are not a good business. In fact, a lot of like famous real estate billionaires said, this is a bad business model and will never make money. So good venture investors, good private equity investors, good growth investors, good executives at any company, whether it's public or privately owned, tend to understand that growth is good, but only if that growth is itself ROI positive. You don't have to be profitable today. It's actually possible to be profit negative, but ROI positive. And that's what good growth investors focus on.
Sounds good. Talking about positive ROI and investments, I want to touch upon your experience running your own hedge fund. Tell us a little bit about what that journey was and what did you learn from that experience?
Sure. So I've been working in a couple of big hedge funds and private equity firms and doing traditional stock picking. And I was doing very well at it. But I realized kind of two things. A, that's a really hard business. And B, it's getting more competitive by the day. And C, I actually discovered something really cool called alternative data. So when you're investing in McDonald's, the typical person walks through a couple of McDonald's to get a sense of how McDonald's is doing this quarter or this year, looks at their menu items and makes up a bunch of qualitative information. I said, screw that. Let's go look at the hard data. Let's go look at how many web traffic searches, what's McDonald's web traffic. Let's go look at cell phone data for how many people are walking to McDonald's. Let's look at credit card data for how many millions of swipes there have been at McDonald's terminals. And there was this enormous wealth of like big data that's sprung into existence over the last decade that I used. And I have a math and physics background, so it was actually very easy for me to take this data and start using it, applying it to investing. And it actually worked. I did this at scale at some of the large institutions I worked at. And then I said, look, why am I doing this for somebody else where it's always a secondary concern? They really want to focus on their core strategy. These strategies, even though they're working and working exceptionally well, are not what the businesses want to do. So I went and started a hedge fund that very specifically focused on using alternative data to do traditional investing. So I did that for about 2 years. There's this website called SumZero, which has 10,000 small and medium-sized hedge funds on it. I was actually ranked number one in the world based on my published research for 18 months out of the 24 that I was running my fund. So the strategy worked. It was great. Unfortunately, the business ultimately failed because to run a scalable asset manager, whether that be a mutual fund or private equity, you need to raise somewhere between $50 to $100 million. And ultimately, I wasn't able to convince investors to put in that sort of money behind my business.
Do you think it was a timing issue? I know the markets went through a couple of series of events where it was just harder to get access to capital. Or do you think it was more a fundamental issue trying to
I think it was honestly, it was an execution issue by me on two levels. Number one is I deeply underappreciated how many investors or capital allocators make decisions based on emotion. Money is a very emotional thing rather than a rational thing. So I could show all this data, I could show all this analytics, but it didn't matter. Number two was, I think one of the things I really failed at, and I could have done this better in retrospect, was I focused really on why the strategy is fundamentally better with a lot of analytics and math. And unfortunately, for most people, the amount of math into why this strategy works is far too complicated. You can think of it almost if you are a startup founder, or there's a lot of venture capitalists that will invest in enterprise software, right? Whether it be a CRM, an HR software, that's easy to understand. Anybody can get it. But then you go talk about infrastructure software and you can't pitch that to a typical venture capital firm. There's only a very few subset of firms that can actually understand the technical aspects of infrastructure. Similarly, when I was talking to my investors, very few people, I did get investors, but those were the ones who either they had a very deep science background, or they were business executives who could sit down with me for 4 or 5 hours and actually understand why my math is not made up wizardry, but actual real hardcore data science. The typical asset allocator, you've got 30 minutes to convince them. They don't want to see equations and standard deviations and sharp scores and statistical probabilities and P ratios or P scores.
So emotions driving a lot of
emotions, and also it's overwhelming. Most people don't have either the academic training or the kind of intellectual heft to sit through complicated topics. It's hard. And like, how often do you go read a math lecture or go read a dense book like War and Peace? Not just mathematical, Most people don't read War and Peace for fun. They fall asleep after about 10 minutes of reading War and Peace.
Yep, that sounds about right. On that note, tell us a little bit about IdeaScale. It's innovation management. What are you really doing? What are your customers using IdeaScale for?
So IdeaScale is the largest idea management or innovation software company in the world. We've been around about 15 years now. We have about 100 people across 8 or 9 countries. And what our software does is you can think of it as a social network for ideas. So if you think about TikTok, somebody posts a funny dance video, other people vote it up or down, that video goes viral. Imagine replacing a funny dance video with an idea. So people put ideas on IdeaScale. Other people vote those ideas up or down. They comment on them. They can iterate on those ideas to take Pratik's idea and make it a little bit better, and then turn those good ideas into reality.
That sounds interesting. Can you tell me a few maybe stories of your customers and how they are really using
Sure.
this for change?
So my customers tend to be large or distributed organizations: Comcast, Pfizer, US Post Office, ING Bank, big media organizations that are struggling to innovate effectively, which is why they call us up and use our software. So I'll give kind of two examples. So number one is one of our clients, they're not a client anymore, but they used to be, is one of the biggest fast food chains in the world. They were running out of ideas for what their new menu items should be, right? They're all their professional chefs and stuff were basically running out of cool ideas. So they came to IdeaScale and said, okay, this is hard. How about we just go ask our customers in a structured, systematic way? And so we became an outwards facing social network for their customers to provide ideas on what the exciting new menu items for burgers or shakes or coffees or whatever should be. And then their customers voted the ideas up and down and iterated on the ideas. You may have suggested a shamrock smoothie, but then a food scientist said, hey, a shamrock smoothie probably has the wrong green color dye and that's dangerous for consumption. So you ended up with this rapidly iterated, open sourced idea network for good foods. And by the way, I think the top 1 or 2 items on that were crowdsourced this way were actually then put on the menu.
That is amazing. And are you using some kind of AI in this whole process?
So, not yet, but our AI tool releases next Wednesday. So exactly a week from today. And what our AI tool does is that it's less to do with with the ideation or creativity process, but it's rather for the selection process. So you can imagine you're an executive at a big organization. You have 1,000 ideas that your customers or employees have put together, and they've upvoted them, downvoted them. There's the social aspect of it. But let's imagine you wanted an objective AI to analyze which of these ideas is actually good for you, right? And applicable. So if you think of going back to good decision making, if you're an executive at McDonald's, let's say, you want to pick a menu item that is relevant for you, and you also want to do something that is impactful for you, right? So McDonald's, a new amazing burger could be great. A steak for McDonald's could make a lot of impact, but it is impractical for McDonald's to offer filet mignon at their restaurants, or at least high-end filet mignon. So what our AI tool does is it assesses it goes through your entire database of ideas and analyzes which ideas are firstly relevant to your organization. Number two, that they are impactful to your organization. And number three, that they are most feasible or easiest to do.
So a lot of innovation, I believe, stems from just the innate sense of human creativity. What do you think is the role of AI, or how do you see the potential of AI augmenting human creativity to encourage more innovation?
So I want to be a little careful of defining creativity. If you look at the research for creativity, like 99.9% of all things that we call creative are actually permutations of things that have been seen in a different context.
Mhm.
And only 0.1% or 0.01% of what we call creative came out of the ether. Like it was just sprang out of nowhere. Most innovation is like, hey, I saw this being done in the manufacturing industry. Why don't we apply it to the software industry, right? A technique, a human process, whatever.
Yeah.
Most creativity is actually just combining things in new ways or in new contexts. I think AI helps with that in 2 ways. Number one, it uh, eliminates an informational gap. Okay. Which is, look, for example, I was doing some analysis on real estate and I actually didn't know a certain terms in real estate. So it's actually hard for me to be creative there, but now I can access this information very quickly and in a very concise manner and communicate it to me in a way that I can understand. It's like a personalized teacher that fills in the gaps as well as lets me do things more quickly. And number two is, and this is a more emotional level, brainstorming is sometimes a really sensitive thing for people, right? I don't want to tell you my idea because You might steal it, or I might just sound stupid. Like my idea is not well thought out. I'm not a great speaker, but I think a lot of that angst about brainstorming or having those early creative sessions with an AI takes away the embarrassment or the kind of social difficulties that it takes interacting with people. Because like almost everybody in the world has some anxiety in dealing with any other human being. And interacting with AI, at least the first stages of the creative process, takes that away from a lot of people, which lowers the barrier for people to engage in creative processes.
Makes sense. Tell me a little bit about how you got into IdeaScale. A lot of founders that I've been speaking to who've had some sort of success or sometimes not conventional success either think of doing another startup or want to be hopefully in a position like yours where there is an engine already there and you're trying to use some of your past experience to take that forward. What got you to IdeaScale? Is there a process for other founders to possibly get CEO roles?
So honestly, I got lucky. I just got a random call from somebody I'd met several years ago and I'm impressed. And they said, "Hey, a friend of mine is looking for a CEO for his privately owned company. Are you interested?" I would say to get this job or maybe the job prior was very much based on luck, maybe a little bit of credibility because I'd spent a lot of time working in some tier one institutions and going to some really good educational institutions. As I think about the next couple steps in my career, I think it'll be a lot easier because I started to build a reputation and people in private equity and venture capital started to know, hey, there's this guy, Nick. He's made impacts at three different companies. So he's probably not just lucky, but rather he's got a way to actually consistently succeed. And I think the next stage probably becomes a little bit more process oriented, where either headhunters or private equity firm start to call me. But these first few opportunities required a lot of hard work and setup, plus a bit of luck.
That's great. For everybody listening, if you've ventured into areas that are very different, like from logistics to e-commerce to hedge funds and so on, and now SaaS. If for folks who are venturing into sort of unknown territories, do you have any tips to avoid some setbacks?
Sure. So, look, whenever you show up in a new industry, I think it's important to be humble and important to be willing to work your butt off to go become, if not an expert, like really competent, because that's going to inhibit or enable your ability to be successful, right? If I show up in I know nothing about oil, but if I went to an oil firm today, the first year of my life would really suck because I'd be spending every waking off hour that I'm not spending on my day job or with family learning about how the oil industry works so that I could be effective as a contributor and as a leader.
Yeah, that makes sense. And I'm going to go back to something you shared earlier, which is even in the US, you've spent time in different cities. And one of the things that comes up very often, at least amongst the founder communities that I'm part of, is people who are trying to move to the US to continue to grow their business or launch new businesses are often in this fix of where to be located. Some people fixate towards being closer to customers. Some people want to be closer to investors. San Francisco is always on top of the list, but a lot of people are starting to believe now that you don't have to necessarily be based in San Francisco. You've spent some time in different cities. What's your take on this whole location sort of thing?
Remember, being in a location has two aspects, or is two dimensions. There's the professional dimension, but there's also a personal dimension, right? San Francisco is an amazing tech city. I don't like the weather there, and weather makes a huge difference to my happiness, right? I like summers that are hot, and San Francisco gets cold. And I lived in San Francisco for several years. I'm just giving an example, right? Conversely, if we moved down to Florida, my wife would hate it. So that would have a huge impact on my quality of life. So there's that personal dimension people need to think about what the impact on their personal moods are, their lifestyle, what they do for entertainment, their families, etc. On the professional aspect, I think, look, I don't have a clear answer. There are centers of excellence where you have concentrations of investors and concentrations of talent. Using San Francisco as an example, there is an extraordinary level of talent there. Stanford's there, Berkeley's there. There's a bunch of good medical schools there. You have this extraordinary database engineering talent pool that has been built up since the 1970s. You have a lot of venture capital firms. So that makes it really extraordinary. But conversely, it also makes it very competitive because everyone else is there, right? Every other startup that's pitching is based in San Francisco. You're all competing for very expensive real estate to set up your office. All the engineers there are paid a lot more. The housing costs are a lot more than if you were to set up your business in Austin, Texas, or Bengaluru in India, or a variety of other highly educated, technologically able areas. So I don't have a clear answer, but I would say that it is important to consider the multiple dimensions, both personal and professional, but then also consider, do you want to be a small fish in a big pond or a big fish in a small pond?
Yeah, I think one of the interesting things that you mentioned is something that most founders probably don't think of is the personal aspect, because every decision that you take impacts your personal life, and what's happening in your personal life, no matter how hard you want to keep that away, it influences your mood and how you show up, and therefore affects your business as well. Yeah. So, Nick, as we wrap up, I want to touch a little bit more on innovation. Do you think there is a formula or a sort of a process to encourage more innovative culture?
Yeah. So at an organizational level, there's actually a very clear research way that your organization can become innovative. Very simple to explain. It's very hard to implement, as you might not suspect. There's three things an organization needs to do all simultaneously. Otherwise, it won't be innovative. Number one, it needs a critical mass of people to be who are themselves innovative or creative. And that number tends to be around 10%. Okay. Not everyone is creative. Not everyone is motivated to create. Let's be honest. And if below 10% of your employee base is not creative, your organization doesn't have critical mass to be a creative organization. Number two, you need to have incentives to innovate and remove the disincentives to not innovate. An example is a lot of companies don't reward people when they do something creative. And when they try something creative and fail, you get slapped, right? You get metaphorically slapped. You get demoted. You get hurt your bonus because you failed. Your project failed. But if you know that new projects are risky and creative projects are risky, if you know you're going to get hit for trying something that is inherently risky and you're not going to get rewarded, guess what? You're not going to do it. That's in fact why a lot of people leave large companies to go start their own companies, because they know if things go well, they'll become a billionaire. And if they fail, like, what's the worst that can happen? Whereas if you fail at a large organization, that may actually derail your career trajectory. And then the third is the right tools and resources. A lot of companies do those first two things. They try and create a great innovative culture with good incentives. They hire smart people, and then they send those smart people off to a dark room and say, go be creative. That would be crazy, right? An artist needs a painter and paintbrush. In the modern day, that means having money, having software like ours, like other tools that enable people who want to be creative and are well incentivized. You don't send a carpenter to go build a building without his or her set of tools. Similarly, it's crazy to me that a lot of organizations tell people to be creative without equipping them with the right set of tools.
Great answer. I think all of that spot on. It reminded me of my times catching up with a few friends who were talking about these sort of large entities having innovation teams. And while it's nice to have an innovation team because it shows that you are invested in innovation, it also is counterintuitive because you then think that's the team that's allowed to do the mistakes and whatever, but everyone may not.
Having an innovation team is a good step. In fact, it's a good signaling mechanism that your organization wants to do it, but it is insufficient if you want institutional level change.
Exactly. And usually those teams sit so outside of, like you said, on the third point, they're so aloof from everything else that's happening that a lot of times things coming out of that team don't get any indication. All right, Nick, great. It was an amazing conversation. Thank you so much for spending time with us. As we sign off, do you have any last pieces of advice, any last words before you sign off?
I'll give two quick things, just two quick plugs. Number one, come check out my personal website, nickjain.com. There's a bunch of my random projects on there, my poker AI algorithm, my version of Flappy Bird. That's just fun, random projects that I do when I've got a baby in one arm and recoding in the other. The second thing is IdeaScale software is completely free for organizations or teams less than 100 people. So whether you're an entrepreneur or you're a team of 99 people at a billion-dollar company like Samsung, our software is completely free, literally no strings attached. So encourage people to check it out. It's probably we're definitely the only people that give our software away for free. And we think it's the right thing to do for our customers and prospective customers.
That is amazing, Nick. Thank you again for joining us and sharing such amazing insights and information. I'm sure it's going to be helpful to a lot of our listeners. Thanks again.
Perfect. Thank you, Pratik.
And that wraps up today's episode. Before we sign off, I would like to thank you for your support and thanks for tuning in. If you loved today's episode, then don't forget to subscribe to this podcast and never miss an episode. Be kind, be happy, challenge the norm. I'll see you folks again for the next one.